I didn't run away. That's what I told myself. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided naming for years: I didn't change my life. I slowly exited it. There was no dramatic decision, no suitcase packed in anger, no farewell speech. I didn't burn bridges or vanish overnight. I stayed physically present while emotionally withdrawing, inch by inch, until my life no longer felt like something I was inside of. From the outside, nothing collapsed. That's what made it possible. I kept showing up. I answered messages. I met expectations. I fulfilled responsibilities. Anyone watching would have said I was fine, maybe a little quieter, a little more distant, but still functional. Inside, I had already started leaving. It began as exhaustion. Not the kind sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from living a life that no longer responds to you. I felt like every day was a repetition of agreements I had made years ago, to roles, to routines, to versions of myself that no longer felt accurate. I didn't hate my life. That would have been easier. I just didn't feel connected to it anymore. I told myself this was normal. That everyone eventually feels detached. That adulthood is about endurance, not excitement. I used reasonable explanations to justify an unreasonable emptiness. The strange thing is, I didn't want something better. I wanted something else. But I didn't know what. That uncertainty frightened me more than dissatisfaction ever could. Wanting something else implied risk. It implied disruption. It implied admitting that the life I had built wasn't enough, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't mine anymore. So instead of confronting that truth, I retreated. I stopped initiating. I stopped dreaming aloud. I stopped investing emotionally in outcomes. I went through the motions while quietly loosening my grip. People noticed changes, but they misread them. They thought I was tired. Busy. Going through a phase. I didn't correct them. Disappearing quietly requires cooperation. I learned how to reduce myself without alarming anyone. I made fewer plans. I expressed fewer preferences. I became easier to manage by needing less. That felt like relief. It was also erasure. I remember realizing one evening that if I vanished entirely, very little would actually change. My absence would be absorbed by systems, schedules, routines. I had made myself replaceable, not at work, not in function, but in presence. That thought should have terrified me. Instead, it comforted me. Because it meant leaving wouldn't hurt anyone too deeply. That's when I knew something was wrong. Healthy people don't fantasize about becoming invisible. I wasn't suicidal. I was absent. I began imagining what it would feel like to simply step out of my life without destroying it. To disappear without consequences. To let everything continue while I stopped participating. I didn't want to die. I wanted relief from being me. I started detaching from my own future. Plans stopped feeling personal. Goals felt theoretical. I made decisions that kept things running but didn't move anything forward. Time passed. I let it. And slowly, I crossed a line I didn't know existed, the line where escape no longer looks like leaving, but like staying while not being there. I hadn't gone anywhere. But I was no longer home. The longer I stayed in that half-exit state, the harder it became to tell where I actually was. I was present enough to function, absent enough not to feel. Days blended into each other, not because they were identical, but because none of them required anything personal from me. I had learned how to live on autopilot without crashing. That skill is dangerous. It convinces you that nothing is wrong because nothing is falling apart. I noticed how little resistance I felt to anything anymore. Good news arrived and passed through me. Bad news did the same. I reacted appropriately, said the right things, offered the expected responses, but there was no internal echo. No sense that events were landing somewhere real. I wasn't numb in a dramatic way. I was neutral. That neutrality became my refuge. As long as I stayed in it, I didn't have to confront the question I was avoiding: what am I escaping from if I never actually leave? The answer began to surface slowly, and I didn't like it. I wasn't escaping my circumstances. I was escaping responsibility for my own life. Leaving physically would have required courage. A decision. An admission that something was wrong and needed to change. Staying allowed me to avoid that confrontation while still giving myself the illusion of retreat. I could tell myself I was just tired. That I needed space. That I was figuring things out. Those phrases bought me time. They also hollowed me out. I started to feel like a ghost in my own routines. I went places without arriving. I spoke without meaning to be heard. I existed without participating. The strangest part was how efficient it all was. I was disappearing without causing disruption. No one stopped me. Because I hadn't left. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to endurance. Being the one who stays. The one who manages. The one who doesn't make things complicated. Quiet withdrawal was the only form of rebellion I allowed myself. But rebellion without movement isn't freedom. It's stagnation with a different name. The fear crept in when I noticed how comfortable the disappearance was becoming. How easy it felt to imagine living this way indefinitely, present enough to survive, absent enough not to hurt. That thought scared me more than any dramatic failure ever could. Because it meant I could lose my entire life without ever making a single wrong move. I began to see how avoidance disguises itself as peace. How emotional withdrawal feels like rest at first. How shrinking yourself feels easier than reshaping your life. I wasn't resting. I was retreating from my own existence. One evening, sitting alone, I tried to remember the last time I had felt fully inside my life, not observing it, not managing it, but inhabiting it. The memory didn't come easily. That frightened me. I realized how close I was to something irreversible. Not death. Disappearance. The kind where your life continues, but you are no longer the one living it. I understood then that escape doesn't always look like leaving everything behind. Sometimes it looks like staying and slowly letting go of yourself. And once you've let go far enough, returning becomes terrifying. Because return would mean feeling again. Caring again. Choosing again. I could feel a moment approaching, a point where I would either step fully out or step fully back in. Staying halfway was no longer sustainable. The quiet exit had reached its limit. I didn't know yet which direction I would choose. I only knew that continuing like this would eventually erase me completely. And that realization finally broke through the fog. For the first time in a long while, I felt fear. Real fear. Not of change. But of never coming back at all. I thought the choice would be obvious when it came. Disappear completely, or come back to life. But when the moment arrived, it didn't feel like a crossroads. It felt like standing in a room where the lights had been off for so long that turning them back on seemed painful. Returning meant sensation. Noise. Emotion. Responsibility. Disappearing meant quiet. Control. Relief. For a long time, I had mistaken quiet for peace. I realized then that my slow escape hadn't been about freedom at all. It had been about anesthesia. I had numbed myself just enough to survive without confronting the question that had haunted me from the beginning: what do I want my life to actually be? That question terrified me. Because wanting something would require choosing it. And choosing it would mean risking regret, not the abstract regret of imagination, but the real regret of lived consequences. I had spent years avoiding that risk. Standing there, emotionally exhausted from my half-existence, I understood something with painful clarity. If I disappeared completely, nothing would explode. But nothing would ever change. I would continue breathing, functioning, aging, while my life quietly slipped past me without resistance. There would be no tragedy. No dramatic ending. Just a person who survived their life without ever inhabiting it. That image finally scared me more than returning ever could. So I stepped back in. Not heroically. Not confidently. Awkwardly. Returning didn't mean everything suddenly made sense. It meant allowing myself to feel again, and feeling was overwhelming at first. Regret surged. Grief followed. Anger at myself for the years I had lost living on autopilot. I had to mourn the version of myself who chose disappearance because it felt easier than choosing change. That mourning hurt. But it anchored me. I began doing small, deliberate things that made me present again. Not dramatic reinventions, honest ones. Saying what I actually felt instead of what sounded neutral. Making choices that required engagement instead of withdrawal. Letting discomfort exist without immediately trying to escape it. Presence was exhausting. It still is. But it's real. I learned that escape doesn't always mean leaving a place. Sometimes it means leaving yourself behind while staying exactly where you are. And returning doesn't require a new life, it requires showing up fully in the one you already have. That doesn't guarantee happiness. It guarantees responsibility. And responsibility, I discovered, is what gives life weight. If you're listening to this and you recognize the quiet exit, the way you've reduced yourself without leaving, the way you've learned to disappear politely, hear this gently. You haven't failed. But you are drifting. And drifting feels safe until you realize how far you've gone without choosing any direction. I escaped my life without leaving anything behind. For a long time, I thought that was a solution. It wasn't. It was just a slower way to lose myself. Coming back didn't fix everything. But it gave me something I didn't have before. A life that notices me when I'm in it. And now, even when it hurts, even when it's heavy, even when I don't know where it's going, I stay. Because disappearing quietly was easy. Being here is the hardest thing I've ever done. And it's the only thing that feels like living.